This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberFire.com, and this is episode 234 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the numberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. One of the things I've talked a lot about on this show is running back value and how I tend to think the masses overrate the position's impact in real football. Running back absolutely matters in fantasy football, but every ounce of research I've done and research that others have done points to the running back position being overvalued in real football. So you may be wondering why I even care about running backs. If they aren't all that valuable, then what's the point of even talking about talent? And that's a valid question. My point of view is that even though I don't think they make a big impact on the field, teams do. Coaches do. And we should assume that coaches are trying to think optimally. And since we know that volume at running back is driven by a coach wanting that player on a football field in the first place, we should then assume that the most talented running backs are going to see volume. Most of the time. With the NFL draft coming up, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this running back class in order to get you all prepared for the draft. So I hit up my friend and coworker, Brandon Gdula, who's been doing a lot of running back research this offseason on numberFire. Now, before we get into that interview, I wanted to remind you guys about FanDuel's Mega Eagle contest that's running this week for the Masters. It's $15 to enter, and there's $1 million in prizes. And the cool thing about the contest is that if Tiger Woods wins the Masters, you get your money back, even if Tiger isn't in your lineup. You should add some extra enjoyment during the biggest weekend in golf. Just head over to FanDuel.com and enter. So Brandon, I want to kick off our conversation and talk about the study that you did on numberFire about running back efficiency in this year's class. Can you explain what that study was kind of all about?
Yeah, so at its core, the article was just about running back rushing efficiency. It is and can be very, very hard to quantify rushing success and efficiency because rushing depends a lot on different variables. Offensive line's a big one. Offensive philosophy in college. It can be a spread offense. It can be a triple option. Team mentality, passing efficiency to help open up running lanes. And as we know, the pass generally sets up the rush. At least at the NFL level, might not be as accurate or applicable at the college game. But we also have studies now that show like 90% of yards per carry at the NFL level can be explained just by how many defenders are in the box at the snap. We don't have that data for college. The charting either isn't there or isn't publicly available. So, what we can say for sure is that using yards per carry is generally a poor way to analyze rushing efficiency. At numberFire, we have our expected points model that doesn't really exist for the college game either. So you have to get a little bit creative. Football Outsiders, thankfully, has done a lot of the heavy lifting there in terms of their own success rate. They have a success rate derived based on yardage gained in terms of your to-go yards. So if it's 1st and 10, you need to get 50% of those yards for a success. It's 70% of the yardage on 2nd down and 100% on 3rd or 4th down. So then from there, I pulled play-by-play data for all of the relevant rushers in this class, compared them to their fellow running backs on the same team. And the goal really was to help adjust a player's efficiency for play on a similar team with a similar philosophy, similar opponents, and even that can have flaws because not every back, of course, is used in the same situations. But really the ultimate goal was to do my best to approximate context-based rushing success.
So what were the findings in the study? Were there any surprises as successes or even surprises as failures?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that this is literally just rushing efficiency. It doesn't account for things like receiving or pass blocking, which we know also matter for running back prospects. This is just a piece of the puzzle. But at the top of the heap was David Montgomery from Iowa State. He is, I think, a good example of what the process was meant to help account for. The Cyclones ranked 102nd in rushing S&P+, which is a Football Outsiders metric used for rushing efficiency. So that means his rushing offense wasn't very good overall. His individual rushing success rate was 39%. Among the 27 backs who went to the NFL Combine, that would have ranked him 18th, so not very good. But his teammates posted a rushing success rate of 25.4%, so that's really, really bad. That means he outperformed his teammates by 13.7 percentage points in terms of that rushing success rate metric, which was the only double-digit difference among the Combine invited class. So that shows us he was very efficient, relative to his teammates. And frankly, if we're banking on these guys becoming NFL studs, big-time producers for our fantasy teams, we need them to be outperforming their backup teammates because these draft hopefuls usually always starters. And Montgomery also led the class in missed tackles per attempt, according to Pro Football Focus. So I think at the very top, that was something that was promising to see. Some other maybe surprises, Raquel Armstead from Temple was second on the list. He might not even be drafted, but he had the second best height-adjusted speed score of any running back at the Combine. He had a good dominator rating, so I think he's someone to keep an eye on. Alexander Madison from Boise State was third. He's kind of short, not even 6 feet, but he's 221 pounds. He's a heavy back, could be sort of maybe a bruiser, a goal line back. Karan Higdon from Michigan was fourth. Nothing particularly pops there, although he did get a lot of work near the goal line for Michigan in 2018. Now, here's a big one. Josh Jacobs was fifth on the list. He was 8.3 points better than his teammates in terms of rushing success rate. Damian Harris, by comparison, was nearly 5 percentage points worse than his teammates from Alabama. So Jacobs has some question marks, but he definitely checks that box. Dexter Williams from Notre Dame was sixth. He's got like a nice dominator rating, solid reception profile, kind of an average speed score. He's kind of like a lot of these guys in the class that don't necessarily pop, but could be useful in the right situations. Alex Barnes was seventh. I love Alex Barnes. I think you love Alex Barnes. He's got a great receiving profile, a top tier dominator rating. A lot of the scouts seem to dislike him, but compared to his teammates, he was pretty good. Now, if we jump down to the bottom of the list, Devin Singletary, people like him. I'm not saying it's wrong. Again, this is just a piece of the puzzle, but his team was actually 30th in that adjusted rushing efficiency metric, according to Football Outsiders. But he had a 35.7% rushing success rate. His teammates were up above 51%. So that's a difference of almost 16 percentage points in terms of rushing success rate. He had a huge dominator rating. He's like a small frame guy. Not a lot of receiving in 2018, but he had more receiving work in years past. But it is a little bit of a red flag if we're looking for red flags in his profile. And then two other guys near the bottom, which it's not necessarily damning for these two because they can be receiving backs at the next level. But Miles Sanders from Penn State was 11.3 percentage points worse. And Penn State was a pretty efficient rushing offense, ranking 17th. He had poor touchdown numbers, but again, he probably projects more as like a third down back than a full-on feature guy. And then Travion Williams, unfortunately, basically the same thing. I like him a lot. He's more of a receiver, I think, at the NFL level. So, but yeah, I mean, you got to take that into account that it's not all about just rushing efficiency.
Yeah, the Josh Jacobs result is pretty interesting, just given the fact that he has a pro teammate in his backfield, and he was able to outproduce him by that much. This running back draft class in general is kind of being regarded as a bad one, I guess I would say. Has your analysis sort of backed that to be true?
Yeah, kind of. If I sort of average out like the scores that I have in my draft model for like the top 30, top 25 or so running backs in each draft class, it's about the worst since 2014, which was like Bishop Sankey and
which is a bad one. Yeah.
Jeremy Hill, Carlos Hyde. Like, I mean, I guess it depends. I mean, Devontae Freeman was there too, but like, is it bad if you're Carlos Hyde or Jeremy Hill? I mean,
right.
It just depends on what you're looking for and what kind of draft equity you put on a player. But I definitely would say that there's not that can't miss guy. There's not a Saquon Barkley. So I mean, I really think this is going to come down to landing spot and opportunity for these guys. I think there are a good handful of these running backs who could be productive or sort of useful for a while, like a Jeremy Hill or Carlos Hyde. I mean, if they land in the right spot. So I think it's just going to come down to that for a lot of these sort of lower level prospects.
Yeah, so you just said that there's not necessarily, to you, this standout running back in this class like we've seen over the last couple of years, whether it's Saquon Barkley, maybe an Ezekiel Elliott, or even a Christian McCaffrey, or a Leonard Fournette if you want to throw him in there from a prospect standpoint. But I think that if you were to say that there's one consensus number one back in this class, it would probably be Josh Jacobs, who we just talked about. But he's definitely not on the level of some of the backs that we've seen over the last few years, like I said. Do you think that Jacobs deserves to be the top back in this class? And if not, or just even if so, where do you think his game is sort of lacking?
So, of course, he checks that box in terms of rushing efficiency relative to his teammates, but I don't know if he's like a first round, if he should be taken in the first round. I mean, he's heavy. He's like 220, he can break tackles. But is that what you want from a first round running back? I don't particularly think so. He had a disappointing 40-yard dash, not much of a production profile in terms of like volume because of the way that he split touches with Damian Harris and even Najee Harris at Alabama. You can, of course, look at the outliers and the anecdotes. You can say, well, Alvin Kamara didn't really have a lot of work in college, but Kamara is still more athletic than Jacobs in terms of the testing. And I have the difference in dominator rating as pretty big as well. I have Kamara at a 23% dominator rating and Jacobs at 13.9, which is a pretty massive gap. I mean, even if you don't have context, you can tell that that's a pretty massive gap. Kamara, an amazing talent, but he benefited a lot from his landing spot in New Orleans. So if you're asking me, can Josh Jacobs be like Saquon Barkley and thrive no matter where he goes? I don't particularly see it based on, everything that I see in his profile. Is he probably going to be the best running back in the class? It's probable. It's definitely possible, especially if he's drafted where he's projected in like the second half of the first round, because draft equity means a ton for opportunity and especially at the running back position.
Yeah. So, a lot of people are saying, as you just noted, that Jacobs could go in the first round. If he does go in the first round, what team do you think might bite?
I mean, I'm usually pretty bad at like projecting who's thinking what, but the two teams that I see and the one team more than any, I mean, it's Oakland and it's Philly. And it really seems like Oakland, I mean, kind of makes sense. Like they have, you can say what you want about their quarterback situation, but if he's going to go there and get like 200, 250 carries, like it's good. I don't know. I'm having trouble thinking that he's like worth that first round pick. I really think it's Oakland, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it makes sense of all teams. I mean, they have the equity. With Philly, it's always tough because obviously it's a need in some way. They did just get Jordan Howard, but it's a need in some way. But they also think pretty analytically, and we know that's anti running early round, first round type running back. So that's another reason why Oakland makes sense.
Yeah, I actually have just a note that like Philly did just get Jordan Howard, and I didn't want to say that Jordan Howard might be
not great.
He might be not great, but like his profile is maybe even just if you strip out like the draft equity, it's might be even better than what Jacobs has.
Yeah, I mean, really, I mean, if you're prospecting through numbers, it's very difficult to say that Josh Jacobs is this premier stud, right? I mean, looking at Saquon Barkley, Saquon Barkley, he had great numbers all around, don't get me wrong, but even like his rushing numbers weren't as great as they could have, like as elite, but his receiving numbers were just so out of control that he went absolutely, I mean, in my model, he went absolutely nuts. But like it's not even close to something like that with Josh Jacobs, which makes him very, very difficult to prospect if you have some sort of process. To this point, it feels like rankings are just kind of all over the place from analyst to analyst with these running backs in this class. So instead of talking about rankings, especially since, as you mentioned, these running backs are going to be pretty landing spot dependent, who do you think are some running backs, maybe two or three of them, that you think people are too low on right now?
Travion Williams, I think, is one. It's hard to get, it's even hard to get like a gauge on what the consensus is for a lot of these options.
Right.
But Travion, I know I pointed him out as someone with poor rushing efficiency. He's got just sort of average athleticism in terms of the height adjusted speed score, but he's a good receiver. He was a voluminous receiver. He's the type of player who can definitely chip in and like get catches and rack up PPR points. So, I mean, if you're looking for like fantasy football, I think that he could become, like a sort of a PPR helper on your teams. He actually had, almost 36% of Texas A&M's touchdowns this year, which is sixth in the class. So even though, The efficiency wasn't great. He's still profiled as someone who could score touchdowns. I think Benny Snell, he had almost 40% of Kentucky's touchdowns in 2018. He's got like a balanced profile. Now, he's not overly athletic by any means. His height-adjusted speed score puts him about 42nd percentile. But with a late-round pick and some opportunity, I think he could be someone who lingers. He's maybe like a Stephen Ridley, which, like, do you want a Stephen Ridley? Probably not. But if you get Stephen Ridley in the 7th round, like, that's fine in the right spot. And then Alex Barnes, I think, would probably be another one who I don't know. The scouts seem not to like him, and I actually bake in scout rankings into my model because I think that the answer to the question between film and analytics is both. I think it just makes sense to use both. And Barnes is someone who doesn't really grade out well in terms of the scouting, but I don't think he has like a super high ceiling, but nobody in this class really does, other than maybe Jacobs if he really hits on everything that people see in him. But Barnes is really no different than a lot of these other mid-round or late-round picks. He's got slightly above average athleticism. So I think there's potential there. He's not a guarantee, but he's not really going to command like a 3rd-round draft pick. So I think that Barnes is a late-round pick, could have some value for sure.
Yeah, and you don't see a lot of size in this class either, and Barnes is someone who has, as you mentioned, great athleticism with that size. What about some of the running backs you think people are too high on? I know that we've already talked about Josh Jacobs, but are there any other guys out there?
So it depends on, again, what the expectations are, but I sort of pinpointed 2. One is Devin Singletary. Singletary could be the 2nd running back off the board. I don't think it would be that surprising based on how some people like him. He grades out poorly in that rushing efficiency metric that I just talked about. He's small, but he does have great elusiveness in terms of the Pro Football Focus charting. Just the size isn't there to be like a featured back, I don't think. He had a lot of the touchdowns for Florida Atlantic. He had 45% of their touchdowns in 2018. His receiving went down, but if you're taking him in the 2nd round as someone to be your 3-down back, I think that's wrong. So I think that from that perspective, people are too high on him. And then Damian Harris. He had the same missed tackle rate as Raquel Armstead. He's not even as athletic as Armstead. I think this could be just one of those cases he played at Alabama, so he's playing tough competition, and that matters. It would not surprise me if he ended up being like a fine, productive running back. He could be like a run first option. I'm not saying he's Sony Michel, but like in that sort of, when he's on the field, he's getting a carry. But I think those two could be overdrafted for maybe how limited they might be at the next level.
Yeah, the Singletary stuff is borderline baffling to me. Obviously anything can happen. He can pan out. That's the way that prospecting works. But there just seems to be so many red flags. You mentioned a lot of them. He has bad size. He didn't test very well at all, especially his speed. And all of that combined, and not only you mentioned the receiving as well. His receiving numbers got worse and worse each year in college. I just think there's a lot of red flags there. It makes total sense that and I'm glad that you see the same thing that I see with him. Are there any running backs that you see could be interesting specialists at the next level, whether that's they're just great pass catchers and they're not going to run between the tackles very often, or maybe they're situational goal line players who could just end up scoring a lot of fantasy points because they're scoring touchdowns?
I think Singletary is one of someone who, surprisingly, I mentioned the touchdowns, and he had a lot of carries from inside the 10 for Florida Atlantic. But I think also if he really turns out to be undersized, but that receiving that got worse, as you mentioned, comes back. Maybe it was like a sort of a game planning thing. He kind of profiles, and it sounds weird, but like a Dion Lewis, if that receiving actually returns and he just is an undersized guy who becomes more of a receiver than a featured back, which he probably can't be at the next level. So I think he could be interesting if he's used as a receiver. Travion Williams as well. He's got like a Duke Johnson sort of profile. So I think he's interesting from a pass catching standpoint. James Williams from Washington State could be a really good receiver. Yes. He has great elusiveness, great receiving marks, so he's someone to keep an eye on. But he's never going to be like a 3-down back. And then if you look at maybe like the goal line options, I'm going to go back to Raquel Armstead from Temple and Alexander Madison from Boise State. Like they could be goal line backs. I mean, you don't really want that on your fantasy team. You would use that on like your favorite team, but Madison's kind of close to like a Corey Clement. These guys could be like that Jeremy Hill, and that's probably fine if you're not overspending on them. And then some other backs who just got a lot of work from inside the 10. Karan Higdon from Michigan. Again, he had some decent efficiency, not the best profile. I think that he's someone we could keep an eye on.
So Brandon, before we go, I need to ask: should we have even had this conversation? Because do running backs even matter?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer here is that not only do running backs not matter, but nothing matters. But, optimistic nihilism allows us some freedom. And even though nothing matters, we can still have a good time. So we can still have a good time, discuss running back prospects. But no, running backs don't matter. I mean, when's the last time a highly paid running back was a key piece to a Super Bowl win?
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir there, man. Brandon, appreciate you hopping on and talking some running backs today. For any of you who aren't following Brandon and his work via Twitter, you can find him at Gdula13. And of course, I'm on Twitter as well, at Late Round QB. And if you're not subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, you can find it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you on Friday with this week's mailbag episode.